Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much again. Today we have Dr. Antje Muntendam, who is an associate professor of Spanish and linguistics in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, and is the acting coordinator and advisor in the linguistics department here at Florida State University. Dr. Muntendam has received a Ph.D. in Hispanic Linguistics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MA in Hispanic Linguistics from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her main area of research is language contact and bilingualism. In her research, Dr. Muntendam has combined sociolinguistics and psycholinguistic methods and approaches. Broadly speaking, her sociolinguistic research focuses on contact-induced linguistics change and the role of social factors, whereas her psycholinguistics research is concerned with online bilingual processing. Dr. Muntendam has conducted extensive field work on Quechua, I believe, an indigenous language in Spanish in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. In addition, she has worked on heritage languages in the Netherlands and in the United States. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful speaker, Dr. Muntendam.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present here today. So the title of my talk is Doing Linguistics Research in and with Underrepresented Communities. Before I start, I would like to give you a little bit of background about myself, even though Kelly has already told you a little bit. But I did my BA and MA in Latin American Studies with a concentration in Hispanic Linguistics at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I became interested in language context and Quechua because of my advisor, who had done extensive research on it. And so in the Netherlands, I took Quechua courses. I studied abroad at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru in Lima. And then I also did linguistic fieldwork for my MA thesis in Bolivia. So that's kind of how I started getting interested in Quechua. And as Kelly said, Quechua is an indigenous language in South America. After my MA, I went to the United States, where I received my PhD in Hispanic Linguistics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I continued taking Quechua courses, and I continued working on Quechua and Spanish, and I did additional field work in Ecuador and Peru. After my PhD, I worked at Middlebury College in Vermont, and I kept working on Quechua and Spanish. Then I moved to the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, and I also started working on Turkish and Dutch. And then finally in 2014, I joined Florida State University, and I'm currently an associate professor of Spanish and linguistics in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. So I want to tell you a little bit about my current research focus, but before that, what is linguistics? So linguistics is the scientific study of language. There are several subdisciplines. So phonology, phonetics look at the sounds. Morphology look at the structure of words. Syntax is the structure of sentences. Pragmatic semantics look at meaning. And then linguists also study language acquisition, language processing, and relationship between language and society. So my own work focuses on language context and bilingualism. I work both in sociolinguistic and psycholinguistic fields. So within sociolinguistics, broadly speaking, focuses on bilingualism and society. So I look at linguistic change and how that is affected by contact, the influence of social factors and linguistic factors on the outcomes of language contact and bilingualism. Then my psycholinguistics work focuses on what happens in the bilingual mind while we process language. So basically, what online processing means, like what happens in real time, right? And so that focuses more at the individual level. Then the empirical domain of my research is contact between Quechua and Spanish in different areas. Then also contact between Turkish and Dutch, and recently also between Spanish and English. And in addition to that, I have recently become involved in a language documentation project of a Native American language here in the United States. So what I want to do today is, so the focus is going to be on doing linguistics research in underrepresented communities. And I hope to show you why this research is interesting and important. And also I want to discuss some of the challenges. So I've divided my talk in 3 parts. The first part will be on linguistics research in and with indigenous communities in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Argentina. Then I will continue with a language documentation project for the Appalachians here in the United States. And then finally, I will discuss a little bit linguistics research with heritage bilinguals, research that we do in the lab here. So to start, Quechua is a name of a language family rather than just a language. So there are about 44 Quechuan languages. These are spoken from southern Colombia to northern Chile and Argentina. And the biggest speaker groups are in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So here on this map, you can see that they're broadly divided in Quechua 1, which is central Quechua, so that's spoken here in the north. And then Quechua 2 is divided in a northern Quechua and southern Quechua. As you can see, the purple here. And then here, Aymara is also spoken, so you get an overlap between Aymara and Quechua. So currently there are about like 10 million speakers of Quechua, but most of these speakers are bilingual in Quechua and Spanish. These are the numbers from Ethnologue for Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But in all of these countries, there's a switch to Spanish. So I want to discuss a little bit why Quechua is interesting and why is it interesting to study this language. So Quechua has a very rich morphology. It's suffixal and agglutinative. This means that you have a root like dog or sea, and you add like particles or morphemes to this root to make longer words. So with our dogs is one word in Quechua where you have dog and then suffixes that indicate with and are. And the same for something like they see me, you have the verb see, and then on the verb you indicate the subject, they, and also the object, me. So in agglutinative languages, you have all these different suffixes that usually have one meaning. Quechua also has reduplication. So for example, in 3, you reduplicate an adjective. So if you say the word for good is ayin, and then if you say good, you get very good. The same for nouns. So you have a noun like tree, you can reduplicate this noun, and then you get among the trees. One of the most interesting aspects of Quechua is evidential marking. So evidential marking refers to the source of information. And so basically you can say the same sentence. So all these sentences mean Juan has arrived, but depending on this particular particle, the perspective changes. So you basically indicate how did you get this information. So when you have this particle me, then that means, speaker has witnessed that Juan has arrived. Then if you add like cha, that means the speaker infers or supposes that Juan has arrived. And then if you add si, that means the speaker has been told that Juan has arrived. So it's not something that the speaker has witnessed. And of course, you can express all this information in different languages, but the interesting part is that in Quechua, you have to indicate this information. So it's actually part of the grammar. Okay, then there are also some interesting features, lexical features. So one of the interesting elements is kinship terms. So in Quechua, there are different terms for son and for daughter, depending on who says it, so whose perspective it is. So for example, the daughter of a woman is Jariwawa, the son of a woman, and the daughter of a woman is Warmiwawa. But if you see it from the father's perspective, then it's Jarichuri for the son and Warmichuri for the daughter. And so similarly, there are 2 words for brother and 2 words for sister, depending on the relationship. So Wauhi is used for a brother of a man, right? And then Turi is used for the brother of a woman. And the same for sisters. The sister of a woman is ñaña, but the sister of a man is paña. So these are just some interesting features from Quechua. So basically what I want to show here is that Quechua has these interesting features that are different from other languages. And it's interesting to look at these features because they're very uncommon in the world languages. And so if we were just to look at a small subset of languages, we would make like inferences, conclusions about languages that are actually not true if we look at like other languages. But Quechua is also interesting for another reason, because there has been so much contact with Spanish. And so most speakers are bilingual in Quechua and Spanish. There has been contact for almost 500 years. And these languages are typologically very different. And so that means you get influence from Quechua into Spanish, but also from Spanish into Quechua. So I just want to mention a couple of features that are different between Spanish and Quechua. So one of the differences concerns the vowels. So Spanish has 5 vowels, whereas Quechua only has 3 vowels, although there's some discussion there, but the vowel systems are different. And so what happens is that bilingual speakers use the Quechua vowels when they speak Spanish. So for example, a word like Pedro with an E and an O, and when a Quechua speaker pronounces it, it will be Pedro because they don't have the E and the O. And then there are also differences in nominal word order, clausal word order, so basically at the sentence level, and then also for question marking. So we'll discuss these in a little bit. Okay, so in nominal word order, there is a difference between Quechua and Spanish in how they express possession. So in Quechua, the word order is like Juan's house. So you get the possessor first, and then you get house, Juan Pahuasin. In Spanish, the order is the opposite. So you get house first, and then who possesses it. So la casa de Juan. But what happens in some bilingual varieties of Spanish is that you hear su casa de Juan. So this is literally what it is in Quechua, where you have Juan and then a possessive marker, and then house, or de Juan su casa. So that one is literally as in Quechua, that is like a different word order, but that is more common. Then at the sentence level, we also see differences. So Quechua is an SOV language. So you have the subject first, then you have the direct object, and then you get the verb. So this means Maria is buying potatoes, or you have Maria, potato, and then exchange, which is basically buy. In Spanish, you get subject or object. So you get Maria compra papas. Right? And so what happens in bilingual Quechua is that SVO word order, as in Spanish, becomes more frequent. So they more often say Maria ramtishan papata, so where the object is at the end. And in bilingual Spanish, you get the opposite. So you get more object for word orders. So you get something like papas compra, and that has like a neutral meaning. Then recently I've been working on question marking. So in Quechua, yes, no questions. So questions that you can answer with yes or no are formed with a particle, a suffix, chu. And so something like, are you going to the town would be town, and then are you going with the question mark. But there's no difference in intonation between statements and questions. So both have a falling intonation. So let's see if the sound works. So this is an example from my research. Oops, sorry. I hope you heard that. Okay, good. So here you heard hopefully a falling intonation at the end. This picture is a picture from Praat, which is a software that we use for acoustic analysis. And you can measure all kinds of things, but this particular line shows the intonation of a sentence or the melody. And so you can actually see that it goes down at the end. So that is for Quechua. Then for Spanish, in Spanish, yes, no questions sometimes have the same word order as statements. So for example, you can have something like viene mañana can be a statement, but it can also be a question if you change the intonation. And so intonation is used in Spanish to distinguish these two sentences, viene mañana versus viene mañana. So yes, no questions typically have a rising intonation then. And then this is an example where you can see, again, this is the intonation contour, and you see that it goes up at the end of the sentence.
¿Tienes una mano?
This is like an Andean Spanish speaker, so it's slightly different if you're used to other varieties.
¿Tienes una mano?
But so what happens in bilingual Quechua is that some speakers don't use the original marking like they do in Quechua, so they don't use the suffix to indicate a question, but they use the intonation as in Spanish. So remember that when we saw Quechua, we saw that the final intonation contour went down, so we saw a falling intonation, and here we see a rising intonation, and this sounds like this. So you clearly hear that it goes up at the end. So there we see an influence from Spanish into Quechua as well. So there is cross-linguistic influence at all linguistics levels. So when we look at sounds, when we look at morphology, when we look at syntax, when we look at pragmatics, we can see an influence from Quechua into Spanish and from Spanish into Quechua. We do see some differences. So for example, from Spanish into Quechua, you see a lot of lexical influence. From Quechua into Spanish, you don't see as much lexical influence, but you see some phonological influence, some syntactic influence, and a lot of pragmatic influence. So the goal then of language contact studies is to build a theory of language contact to basically try to predict what is transferred from one language to another and in which circumstances. So we look at the direction of influence and also at the effects of linguistics and social factors. So I don't want to go too much into the theory, but the importance is that the outcome of language contact and bilingualism depends on the varieties that are involved and also on the sociolinguistic context. So that brings me to the context of my research and more about like, what is it like to do research in these communities? So as I said before, most of my research is in Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. And so these are just some pictures just to give you a little bit of an idea of the places where I do my research. So this is in Peru. This is the house that I lived in Peru, and this is the house that I lived in Bolivia. So usually when I do my research, I live in the community. So I usually live with a family because there are usually no hotels. And then I stay there for a while and try to participate. So I want to talk a little bit about these communities and also some methodological considerations. So these are small rural communities in the Andes. My participants, usually I work with adult bilinguals. Most of the speakers are bilinguals. Some are monolinguals in Spanish. Sometimes you find some monolingual Quechua speakers, but these are usually older speakers or in more remote areas. So most of my participants are bilinguals. They're either simultaneous bilinguals. So simultaneous bilinguals acquire both languages at the same time at home. And some of my participants are early sequential bilinguals. So these participants learn Quechua at home as a first language, and then usually they acquire Spanish when they enter school. So there's a lot of variation among the speakers, but often they are low literate, definitely in Quechua, except for some of the younger people, and sometimes also in Spanish, and especially in the more remote areas, people are lower educated. The language use, they tend to use Quechua and Spanish on a daily basis, but in different domains. So Quechua is used mostly at home. It's used in the town with other Quechua speakers. It's used in the field. In some places there is bilingual education, so you get some education in Quechua. but in other areas there's not. Spanish is used sometimes also at home with other Spanish speakers, obviously, when they go to town and in more like administrative and public domains. So importantly, these speakers often speak non-standard varieties of Quechua and also of Spanish, and they mix. So the Quechua has influence from Spanish, the Spanish has influence from Quechua, and that sometimes leads to negative language attitudes. And these are also discriminated populations, of course. And this has an effect on how we do our research as well. So I want to talk a little bit about methodological considerations. So one is obviously ethics. So we need to make sure that we follow protocols, that we consult local institutions, that we take into account language attitudes, indigenous rights, and that we, of course, get informed consent when we work with human subjects. Before starting the research, one wants to make sure that you learn about the culture and the local customs. So you want to know, like, well, what is done in these cultures? What shouldn't I do? And sometimes it's like very basic things, like not reject food even when they give you a lot of food. You need to establish initial contacts with the community. So usually I find one person that I know who then brings me to the community. And then before starting the research, you want to make sure that you establish personal connections with people in the community and participate in daily life. So basically, when I do my research, I cannot just go in, get my data and leave. I usually live in a community for a while. And once I get to know the people, then I start collecting data. And I usually stay a while after collecting data as well. So the type of communities also has an effect on the data collection and the task and the materials. So tasks and materials need to be adapted to these communities, and all the materials need to be normed with community members. So often in linguistic research, we use background questionnaires, and these are especially important for these type of communities because there is a lot of variation. So we use sociolinguistic background questionnaires that have questions on their age, education, profession, language proficiency, language use. Often these questionnaires are used to select participants and also to explain variation in results. So if we see the results and we see that there's a lot of variation between participants, usually I go back to the questionnaire to try to explain that. So questionnaires are often very formal and they're often written. And so usually I present questionnaires in an informal conversation. So I don't give the questionnaires to the participants, but I just ask them the questions. And then I also try to not include technical terms. So I try to rephrase the questions and make them specific so that they can understand. And then the participants, their answers can be confirmed by observation and conversation with other community members. So for example, when I ask them what language they speak at home, like growing up or even at that time, I can later confirm that with observation. Okay. Another important tool in linguistics research is naturalistic data or sociolinguistic interviews. So these are useful to get new information on a language or a language variety, and also to get some information about frequency of different features and when they are used. So one of the issues in sociolinguistic interviews in general, and not just in these populations, is the observer's paradox. So the observer's paradox basically says that we're trying to observe people, they speak normally when they're not being observed, but we have to do that by observing them and by using a recorder. So that is the paradox that we try to get the natural data in a not natural situation. So to minimize the effects of the observer paradox, there are a couple of things that we can do. So we can use questions that elicit relatively spontaneous speech. So often we ask questions that engage participants or that elicit emotional reaction. So something that affected them a lot, or something that scared them, or something that surprised them. We also include topics that are relevant to the community and to the speakers. So obviously for this, you need to know a little bit about the community and what is relevant. And then we also try to create an informal setting. So most of my data collection actually occurs like at participants' home or somewhere where they feel comfortable. Sometimes it's also helpful to have group interviews or just conversations between two people or both community members. And this is especially important when you're not a community member, like myself. So it helps to get more informal data and more accurate data. Another method that I've used in my research is picture story tasks. So these tasks are helpful because they collect semi-naturalistic data, and you can collect similar data for different people because you know, like, okay, at least this is the content, so you know that all of them are going to talk about similar things. So one of the things to think about in using picture story tasks is culturally appropriate pictures, culturally appropriate stories. So this is an example of a story that I used where, so it's about a fox who wants to go to the moon. And so he goes to a condor and asks the condor to take him to the moon. And so I have like a whole series of pictures that narrate the story. But basically the idea is like, while they're flying to the moon, they encounter this bird, and the fox insults the bird and the bird cuts the rope. And so the nice thing about this story is that most people in the area are actually familiar with these stories. They grew up with these stories, or at least variants of these stories. So it's a little bit easier for them to tell these stories. And they're also relatively appropriate for adults. Right? And so this is useful when you cannot use reading. Then another test that we use are acceptability judgment tests. So acceptability judgment tests are used to test specific hypotheses about language. And usually what you do is you present a participant with a sentence, often a written sentence, and you ask them if that sentence is acceptable or grammatical. So for these participants, you obviously want to adapt it a little bit. So you want to present sentences more in an oral modality and not written. I often change the instructions. So in acceptability judgment tests, often the question is like, is this sentence grammatical or is this sentence acceptable? But when you work with stigmatized varieties, they will say like, no, and they will reject all the sentences if they know that's a stigmatized feature, right? And so usually what I do is I change the question to like, do people in the community use this kind of sentence, or have you heard this kind of sentence? And we also want to make sure that sentences are not rejected for irrelevant reasons. So for example, if you include lexical items that participants are not familiar with, they might just reject the sentence for that reason, or if they just don't like the meaning of the sentence. I also have worked on intonation, so the melody of the sentences, as I showed before, and this research poses additional challenges. So one of the things that is more important for intonational research is the quality of the recording, because if you have a lot of background noises, it distorts the signal, and that basically has an effect on your data analysis. You also need to control sentences for a number of words, number of syllables, stress placement, voiceless consonants, etc. So there are a lot of things that you have to take into account. So for this reason, most of the intonation research traditionally has been based on laboratory-based research, highly controlled reading task where you really control for the number of syllables, stress placement, all that stuff. But obviously, this is not an option in these communities. So we need tasks that are appropriate for low literate populations that do not require reading, but we still want tasks that allow for some control over the data. So this is one of the tasks that I use. It's an interactive task. It's a game between two participants. And I use this task to collect data on statements and questions. And so there are two participants and there's a screen in between them. Both participants have like a stack of question and answer cards with objects in different colors. And they ask and answer questions in turn. So for example, the participant A would have a card like this, so just a white card with a question mark, and in the instruction they learn that then they're supposed to ask, what do you have? So that elicits a particular type of question. Then participant B has, for example, this card and would just respond what he has on his card. So for example, I have a purple moon. Then another question card could be like this one, like, do you have a purple cat? So it's a purple cat with a question mark. And then the answer card would be the same. I have a purple moon. But so now you see it's again a statement. It's the same sentence as before, but now you get a contrast between cat and moon, right? And so it elicits different types of statements. And then similarly, we can ask, do you have a black moon? I have a purple moon. So again, we have the same statement, but now there is the purple part is highlighted. So this is a way to basically collect semi-spontaneous data, but still have control over the data. The participants also had like this sheet with all the different objects, and they were told that they needed to mark their partner's answers. And that was basically to give a purpose to the game so that they were actually doing something. So the nice thing about this task was that it's a task between participants. So two participants play it. As a researcher, I'm not involved. It's informal because it does feel like a game. There's no reading. But it's still controlled because the context of the questions and answer was very specific, very controlled, and all the items were selected based on the number of syllables and all that kind of information. So another task that we recently developed is this map task. The idea is similar. So this is also meant to elicit questions. So questions like, where do you see something? And so there are two participants and they have the same map with the same landmarks. So there's a mill, there's a church, a house, etc. But then they have different items in the map. And so they also have question cards. Oops, sorry. And the participants then need to ask where those objects or animals are in the other participant's map. So for example, participant A would say, like, where do you see a donkey? And then participant B would respond that the donkey is here. And then the purpose of the game is that by the end of the task, they have the same maps. So those are just two examples to show some tasks that can be used in these communities that do not involve reading and that collects like reliable data. So something else I wanted to talk about is community involvement. So I already mentioned that I usually norm the task and the materials with the community. But we also try to collaborate with local institutions, try to involve them in our research, share language materials or corpora. So when I collect data, I share it. We also train community members in doing research. So recently, one of my colleagues has done that, where she basically trained people in the Andes to do the research, and they collaborate on our projects. We also try to help create materials for bilingual education. We present at local workshops, so workshops for the communities, and also organize symposia and make publications accessible. So a lot of our publications are in English, but the local people cannot always read English, obviously, so sometimes we translate. Okay, so why is this all important? So from a linguistic or theoretical perspective, Quechua and the language context situation is interesting because there are features that are not common cross-linguistically, as I said before. So it gives us a different perspective on language and how the human mind works. It contributes to linguistic theory. As I said, these languages, like Quechua, is an endangered language. And so if we lose that language, we also lose their worldview, their way of conceptualizing their role and cultural knowledge. From a societal perspective, it's important to maintain these language varieties for the speakers themselves. It's connected to their identity. It's also by studying their languages, we hopefully increase the appreciation of their language and culture, and hopefully can change language attitudes and get more positive language attitudes. So I should say for Quechua, recently there has been more attention for Quechua. So there has been more Quechua in social media. You see it more in movies. So this is a movie, Los Ojos del Camino, where there is a lot of Quechua. And this is actually one of our collaborators who we trained in linguistic research as well, but he's a poet. And then there's also Quechua rap. So recently Renata Flores has become more famous, and even the New York Times mentioned her. But so there is more and more attention for Quechua, which hopefully also influences the attitudes. So I would like to switch to the second part of my talk on documenting the language of the Appalachians. So this is a project that has been funded by the President's mini grant for diversity and inclusion. So the goal is to document the language of the Appalachians. So the Appalachians used to live in Northwest Florida. So here, they were allies with the Spaniards, but then when the British attacked the Spaniards, the Appalachians moved first to Mobile, which was French owned at the time. And then later when the British took over there, then they moved to central Louisiana. So now they're in central Louisiana. They have been there since the 18th century. And currently there are approximately 300 descendants of the Appalachians who are organized in the Appalachian Tamale Band. And they have a website if you're interested. But so they're very interested in maintaining their culture and in revitalizing their culture, and that also means their language. And specifically, there are two speakers of their language that are currently willing to speak to us and have asked us to document their language. So Appalachian is a Muskogean language. Muskogean languages are the largest group of Native American languages in the southeastern US. There are 6 languages that are still spoken today. So Choctaw, Chickasaw, Alabama, Coasati, and there are more than, Miccosukee and Creek. So 6 are still spoken today, but then Appalachian and Ichiti are supposed to be extinct. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so all these Muskogean languages have a small phonemic inventory, and they have complex morphology. So interestingly, the only document in Appalachia is a letter that was written by caciques, chiefs, in 1688 to Charles II of Spain. And this document formed the basis for a description of an Appalachian grammar and also vocabulary. But so it's all based on this one letter. And so this is an example from that letter that shows that Appalachian is an agglutinative language. It has complex morphology. It has a relatively rigid subject-object-verb word order. So when you look at the glosses, so you get father, so the subject, then the object soul, and then several verbs, so subject, object, verb. And this means our fathers clean, scrub, purify, and open the eyes of our souls. And so you see that there's complex morphology going on. But so this language is considered to be extinct. So in that sense, it's unlikely that the current speakers in the Appalachian community speak this. Another option is that they speak Mobilian jargon. So Mobilian jargon is also known as a Chickasaw-Choctaw trade language. It's a Native American pidgin spoken in the lower Mississippi River Valley and nearby areas. So that is shown here. So basically this entire part that was where it was spoken. Pidgins are contact languages. So these are languages that emerge in multilingual settings when groups that don't have a language in common create a language. And the structure of this particular pidgin is mostly from Muskogean languages, possibly some other languages that were spoken in the area, but it has a reduced morphology like other pidgins. And the vocabulary is mostly from Chickasaw and Choctaw, but it also has some words from other Native American and European languages. So this shows like the reduced morphology. So if we have a sentence here, I don't cut it with a knife, we see that you have a word for knife, word for eye, word for cut, and then a particle that is past, but it's also a separate word. So here we see that there's no complicated morphology. And like a lot of pidgins, there is a particle for past tense or a separate word for past tense. And the same here for she has 3 children, we see that they're all separate words. So there's no complicated morphology. So there's some debate about the origins of Mobilian jargon, but according to Drexel, it emerged in pre-colonial times and it was used as a lingua franca between Native Americans. So lingua franca is also a language that is used between groups for communication between groups. Later it was used between Native Americans and Europeans as well. And then at some point in the early 19th century, it was not just used as a trade language anymore, but became the language of the community and a marker of their identity. It was first attested in 1699. Until the 1950s, it was still in use. And in the 1980s, there were some older speakers in Louisiana who knew some words and phrases, but that's basically all we know about Mobilian jargon. So again, this is another option, maybe more likely than the Appalachian language. A third option is that the Appalachians speak another Muskogean language, so one of the languages that is still spoken today. Because several of those languages, even though they're threatened, they still have several hundreds of speakers. So then the goal of our project is to determine first which language these elderly members of the Appalachians speak, and also to document their language for future generations. To do that, we've planned fieldwork in collaboration with Aaron Broadwell from the University of Florida, and also a videographer from the Osceola Research Institute. The data will be elicited sentences, spontaneous conversations, stories, and they will all be video recorded. We will then describe everything in annotation software and analyze the data with colleagues here in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. And then the output will be recordings, transcriptions, a grammar, word list, etc., which will all be shared with the community. So why is this important? Well, these languages have several characteristics that are uncommon in different languages, so that adds to our linguistic theory. As I said, Appalachian and Mobilian jargon are believed to be extinct. All the other Muskogean language are threatened. So if they speak one of these languages, then we will be able to collect more data on these languages, get more information. So that adds to our knowledge of linguistic diversity in the southeastern US. And there are very few corpora available even on the Muskogean languages. From a societal perspective, it is important because it will increase our understanding of the Appalachian language and culture. Community members will be included in all steps of the project. They will receive the documentation materials, and we hope that we can help the community to rebuild or maintain their identity and also their language and culture. And more generally, we hope that it will lead to an increased appreciation of Native American languages and cultures and to their transmission to the next generations. So finally, the last part, I want to talk a little bit about linguistic research with heritage bilinguals that we do in the lab here at FSU. So heritage speakers or heritage bilinguals are bilinguals who speak a minority language at home as a first language, and then they speak the majority language of the society as a second language. They're different from other bilinguals like second language learners because usually their second language is actually their stronger language, their more dominant language. When we look at the languages of heritage bilinguals, there are some subtle differences when we compare them to control groups. And these differences are sometimes difficult to capture with offline methods. So offline methods are things like sentence judgment tasks, where you measure after the fact. So we use implicit techniques and online methods. So we use reaction time studies, EEG, eye tracking. So this is a typical eye tracking setup. So the participant sees something on the screen. So there's either a visual presentation of a stimulus or they hear a sentence or a word. So the subject performs the task, and while he performs the task, the eye tracker records the eye position. And that is recorded for each trial. So eye movements are correlated with cognitive processing. So that allows us to look at processing in real time. So we can find differences that cannot be observed with other methods. And this is particularly useful for working with stigmatized varieties because these measures are not affected by language attitudes because it's implicit. Right? Whereas like sentence judgment tasks, for example, they're often affected by attitudes towards the language. So this is actually the eye tracking setup in our language processing and eye tracking lab here at FSU. So to give you an example, we did a reading experiment with eye tracking with heritage speakers of Turkish in the Netherlands. And we presented them with sentences like this one. So in English, the barkeeper smokes the cigarettes in the alleyway, not in the party room in which it is prohibited. And so the interesting thing about these sentences is when you first read the sentence until the comma, you think it's all new information. And then after the comma, you realize, oh, there is a contrast between alleyway and party room. And this is interesting because in Dutch, like in English, you can have contrastive information after the verb, but in Turkish, you can only have new or contrastive information before the verb. So what happens is that speakers who have Turkish as their first language, they get confused when they see that there is a contrast between party room and alleyway because they expect this to be given information. And so we can measure that they get confused because they pause longer, they go back. So actually when they see the party room, they get confused and their eyes jump back to alleyway. So this allowed us to find an effect from Turkish on Dutch during processing. And so the interesting thing is like these speakers have Dutch as their dominant language. And so you don't really notice that much influence from Turkish at the syntactic level when you talk to these people, but you can actually see it with eye tracking. Okay, so another type of study that we do with heritage bilinguals concerns code switching. So code switching is the alternate use of two languages within an utterance. So for example, in 22, you get the first part of the sentence in English. Sometimes you start the sentence in English, y termino en español, and then you end it in Spanish. And so research has shown that code switching is not a random mix of two or more languages. So this is, sometimes lay people think it's random, but it's not. It is in fact rule governed. And so there is a debate regarding the rules of code switching. So when do people code switch? When does it sound okay? When does it not sound okay? And there are different theoretical models that have been proposed to account for this. Because these models have different predictions. So what we do in our lab is that we experimentally test the predictions of these models. So this is an example from a study on subject pronoun finite verb switches. So we use sentences like this one, where you get Alicia reads a book while she rests on the couch. and you get a switch between the pronoun and the verb. And so one of the models that we looked at says that this switch is acceptable, whereas another model says it's not acceptable. And so what's interesting with code switching is that it's mostly an oral phenomenon, and it's often stigmatized. And so that's why we try to use more implicit methods. So in this case, we used a concurrent memory loaded repetition task. So this basically means like the participants heard a couple of numbers, then they saw a picture that provided a context for the sentence, then they heard the sentence, a beep, and then they were asked to repeat the numbers and the sentence back. So that makes it harder because otherwise they can just immediately repeat what they hear, but now they actually had to wait a little bit. And so the idea is that the sentences are filtered through internal grammar before you repeat them back. And so the idea is then that if the sentence doesn't sound good to you, you modify it in a way that it does sound good. And so this allowed us to find support for one of the models and against the other model, basically. Okay. The last thing I want to present is this is an ongoing study of one of my graduate students at Anderson. So in this study, we also looked at code switching and eye tracking, but he uses the visual work paradigm where participants hear a sentence and then they see two pictures on the screen. So he looks at the processing of code switched ambiguous relative clauses. So if you have a sentence like someone worked with the driver of the lawyer that was by the elevator, different languages interpret this differently. So in English, you would say like the lawyer was by the elevator, whereas in Spanish, you would say the driver was by the elevator. And so the interesting thing is what happens when you put this in code switching. And so we use the visual world paradigm because the participant then listen to a sentence and they look either at this picture or at that picture. And so we measure where they look at, and that gives us an idea of how to interpret the sentence. Okay. So it shows sentence processing in real time and how bilinguals handle more than one language in a mind. I believe it's important to include different types of bilinguals in research because that allows us to also look at different factors like social factors, effects of age, and context of acquisition. We try to involve heritage bilinguals and code switches in our research. So they help us norm the data. Sometimes they are involved in data collection. And for this research, we also hope that we get more appreciation for heritage languages and bilingualism, and also an appreciation for code switching as something that is rule governed and actually requires a high level of proficiency in both languages. Okay, so to conclude, I hope to have shown the importance of doing linguistics research with these community, both from a theoretical perspective and a societal perspective. I believe these languages and type of bilinguals provide new information, enrich linguistic theory, and also increases the appreciation of linguistic diversity and bilingual practices. And in all, I think we need an increased community involvement in all stages of the research, for instance, by training members of the community. Okay, so I want to acknowledge my collaborators, and I'm also the funding agencies. And if you have any questions, this is my email. And of course, now there's time for questions as well.